He assumed that these women would want to, know that he's not having sex with the other women. He assumed that, right? And you can see what happened with Kaity. Kaity was like, I didn't even need to know any of this. Like, you are making assumptions about my needs instead of asking me about my needs. And that's what the no sex ban from the very top involved him assuming what his future wife would want. And instead of actually talking to the women that he has here, right?
Hi everyone, I'm Julie, she's Kelly, and we're here to find love. We're in Bachelor Season 27, Episode 10, and we're back again this week and every week to recap Zach's season. For those of you who don't know us, we're two dating coaches who analyze the relationship psychology and dating themes in reality TV shows, especially The Bachelor. So if you're into this sort of stuff, hit the subscribe button to follow along and join the conversation.
This week was Fantasy Suite Week, or as Zach likes to call it, Sex Week.
This week is viewed as Sex Week.
And oh boy, it was a time. This was quite the Fantasy Suites week, and really Zach brought it all on himself. Let's quickly recap exactly what happened this week, and then we're gonna just give some general reactions because there was so much happening here, and then we can get into the nitty-gritty details of each event. But basically what happens is Zach starts off Fantasy Suite Week by saying that he is not going to be having sex. He declares a no sex ban for Fantasy Suites Week. He tells Jesse,
this is the week where can hit the fan. It's not conventional, but I decided that there will be no sex of any kind for Fantasy Suites.
You're really gonna be able to pull this off? Because you are gonna be tempted.
And then he proceeds to tell each of the girls on their dates that that's what he wants to do. So he tells Ariel, they go to their fantasy suite, they don't have sex. Next day, he goes to Gabi's fantasy suite, and that's where things fall apart because they do end up having sex, even though he had told her in the beginning that he didn't want to have sex in this overnight. He seems very guilty about it, and so he tells Jesse, and then he tells Gabi that he needs to tell everyone else about what happened. And so he goes to his last fantasy suite date with Kaity and tells Kaity that he had had sex with Gabi the night before. Kaity understandably is distraught because it's a lot to take in when you think you're about to just go have like a romantic date an overnight with your man, and instead you have to deal with all that information. But they go through with the date, and he ends up giving Kaity and Gabi both roses. Ariel goes home without ever learning that any of this happens. So that was the overview of what happened on this episode, and there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to say.
When I was watching the episode, I kept thinking, what is Kelly thinking about this episode? What is America thinking? Because Fantasy Suites, it's literally in the name. It's a fantasy. It's like between you and the person. So for Zach to kind of pull the Clayton and involve all of the women into his decision-making process, which was unilateral, it wasn't something he made with them being a part of the conversation. He was like, I feel like this is an idea of the relationship I want, without taking any of their needs about intimacy or their thoughts and feelings into consideration, when he like just completely made this week off limits in every single way. He kind of painted himself in a corner. The best leads tend to go into each of the relationships as if they're their own relationship. He really showed his hand, actually. Like, by him having conversations the way he did, it made me realize, oh my God, Ariel was never a contender. It's Kaity, because he wanted to tell Kaity so badly what he did because I think that he wants to be with her, or maybe he wants to be with Gabi. I'm not totally sure.
This whole thing really confused me. It was, when I was watching it, I was like, it felt like it was like nonsensical action after nonsensical action after nonsensical action. So it was like even hard for me to really react to, because it was like one nonsensical action begot another one, begot another one, begot another one. So it's like the core thing made no sense. Every action after that was like building on something that didn't make sense. And so I think that's why it was so hard to really know how to respond to what was happening here. Because to your point, nobody said anything to Zach about wanting to have him not have sex with anyone else, right? He ostensibly was doing it like, oh, because I don't want anyone to be stressed and worried about, who's having sex and like, being worried about me being intimate with other women. I don't want anyone to be worried about that. ostensibly it was for their benefit, but no one had communicated any kind of concern about that. No one had said anything, at least from what we saw, no one had said anything about that to him. So it was kind of like he assumed that this might be something that was important to them. And then what was hilarious to me was that actually for Ariel and Gabi, they had the opposite reaction. They were like, oh, like, I did want to have sex on this date. Like, that was something that, in fact, they had not been concerned about him having sex with people on fantasy suites, and they had wanted it. So it was kind of like he just made an assumption about what they needed based on, I don't know, maybe him watching previous seasons.
He did have a fantasy suite interaction, and it was with Rachel. And in that fantasy suite date, it like went off the rails in some way. We don't know what happened, but I wonder if he was bringing that previous experience into how he handled of just having a no sex rule at all. Like maybe Rachel is intimate with someone else and she told Zach about it, and Zach, you know, carried that interaction into his season. I'm not totally sure what it was, but it was so, like, no one told him to do this. Like Sean Lowe,
right,
you know, has been his mentor this entire season, but Sean didn't have sex because he was Christian. It wasn't like Zach even had that as some kind of blockage or like some stop of being like, this is why I can't do it. He just literally chose it for no reason. He made this weird promise for no reason, and it backfired on him completely.
By the way, if that is what happened with Rachel's fantasy suite, it's like, I don't understand why we don't know what happened on this fantasy suite.
We still don't know.
It's like, we still don't know. I still don't understand. So it's like, it's hard for me to like really wrap my head around like what he is referencing every time he calls back. He's like, everything hit the fan on my fantasy suite with Rachel. I never know what the heck he's talking about. So it's just, I can't with that. I'm so over him talking about that, because if you're not going to, Mr. Honesty over there, if you're not going to tell us what actually happened, it's like, we can't relate to you when you talk about this. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. But I do think there's this general popular talking point, like a popular point of view among some people in Bachelor Nation, which is like, it's ridiculous to expect someone to be okay with getting engaged to someone who just slept with 2 other people the week before, right? People say that pretty often, I would say, around the time of Fantasy Suites Week. Often when it's like, when someone like Susie from Clayton's season or Maddie from Peter's season, when one of the girls or someone expresses that they are uncomfortable with the lead having sex with multiple people, usually there is this conversation about, you know, that makes sense for them to be upset. It makes sense for them to not want to get engaged to someone who just, you know, had to have sex with 3 different women before he could make a decision. So people do have this belief. I think there are a lot of people who do have like a core issue with the Fantasy Suites Week concept. I think a lot of people don't like imagining their partner having sex with other people. We're talking about monogamous folks. And so, of course, there's a lot that makes this week very uncomfortable. However, sex is just part of relationships. And I think when we intentionally try to hold it in as like this thing that is special or unique or in some way like different from other parts of a relationship, I think that is putting sex on a pedestal that is not necessary. Because sex is special, but it's not something that is any different. Like, nobody was really talking about the fact that Zach said I love you to more than one person. Like, Zach is doing a lot of things with multiple women. Sex is one of those things that could have been happening, but you know, that's what you're doing here. You're signing up for a process wherein someone pursues anywhere from 2 to 6 relationships equally seriously, right? That's the whole point of this process. That's always what happens, right? He will pursue, you know, 2 to 6 people maybe, and really actually progress those relationships all the way to the point of where an engagement would be appropriate. And then he'll decide at the end which one he likes the most and which one he's actually going to take that leap with. But that is always what happens. And progressing a relationship to the point of an engagement often involves having sex, right? And so the process kind of requires a bit of a compartmentalization, right? Like, each person needs to see just their own relationship with Zach, and Zach needs to think about each relationship as their own. But kind of what he was trying to do, to your point, Julie, by making this no sex ban, was he was kind of thinking about all 3 of them together, as opposed to he was kind of breaking down that compartmentalization in a way that actually didn't benefit anyone. It actually was harmful to all of the people involved. It hurt Gabi, it hurt Kaity. I'm sure Ariel, looking back on this, is very upset. And so his attempt to like break down the compartmentalization and try to think about it in this like, oh, well, the person at the end won't want me to have sex with the other two women, and so I'm gonna try to like let all of the women know about how I'm doing with the other women. It confused things, and it kind of broke down the understanding that I think each woman goes into Fantasy Suites week with, which is that he may have sex with other women. I understand that's part of this, and I've already been emotionally preparing myself for this. And so for Zach to come in swinging and upend all the expectations and kind of change it up, I think hurt them more than anything else. You know?
So well said, because he was being honest and straightforward, but he was doing it in a way where he wasn't really taking in how the other girls might have been feeling about his decision. The other thing too is that he got into their heads in a really, really big way. Like now Kaity is thinking of Gabi is thinking of Kaity, and that was seen by the very last rose ceremony that they had together, where Kaity looked at Gabi and was like, yeah, like, I know what happened. And that is awful, because like at this point of the season, there is that subtlety of knowing they are kind of my direct competition to me getting this man that I really, really want. But there's like usually that illusion of separation. You don't know what's really happening. You're trying to focus on your own stuff because a lot of anxiety can set in. That is not happening at this particular point anymore, because now they both know where they're at with both stages. Gabi knows Katie's important enough to be told something very intimate that happened between her and her partner, and Kaity knows that something between them happened physically that she did not have of Zach. So there's a little bit of comparison happening. Comparison breeds a lot of jealousy, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of mind games. So in this situation, I just thought, dang, like Zach, he did a very noble attempt of being honest, but he did it without, like, with blinders on. And then once he was in the fantasy suites, I don't think that he really considered what would happen if, for example, Gabi took it as a creative challenge almost, or like a conversation that she wanted to have with them privately, and that's what led to them having sex. Like, he didn't consider what their perspectives would be, what their desires would be, and it fell apart on him dramatically. And I did not like how he just did every mess up that you could do as the Bachelor. You say I love you, because he said to all of them, I don't want to say the L word unless I know. So then not only does he have sex with Gabi, now he says I love you to Gabi, or I'm falling in love with you. She must be so confused, because everything about his choices are saying you're the final pick, but it seems like there's an act of resistance almost, because he didn't, keep that sex act between them private. He didn't say I love you in this romantic setting. He did it when he was like, I feel so guilty, but don't worry, I don't regret our actions. And by the way, I'm falling in love with you, if you wanted to be certain. So a lot of it just felt like he was just band-aiding something up, and you could tell that Gabi is a smart woman. She was very aware that Zach was acting very, very like disorientingly confusing and very sideways. So she doesn't really trust a lot of what he's saying to her, because it's mimicking a lot of her past behaviors in her relationship.
If I'm Gabi, I mean, especially in that last scene, I mean, they did such a good job of like showing him like putting all his eye contact on Kaity and like kind of not really looking at Gabi. He gives this whole speech about like, I made some mistakes. I couldn't keep my word. And I have a lot of regrets about how this week went. And it's like, he's just sitting there saying, I regret having sex with Gabi. Like, if I'm Gabi and like my partner describes sex with me as a mistake, I'd be like, what the heck is this, man? It's just so hurtful, right? And like, it's exactly that. It's like he's not thinking enough about how each of his actions are impacting people. Like, I don't think he's thinking enough about that. And he assumed that these women wanted him to have this no sex thing. He assumed that these women would want to know that he's not having sex with the other women. He assumed that, right? And you can see what happened with Kaity. Kaity was like, I didn't even need to know any of this. Like, you are making assumptions about my needs instead of asking me about my needs. No sex ban from the very top involved him assuming what his future wife would want. And instead of actually talking to the women that he has here, right? And it was that assumption that really has landed him in hot water, right? It was the assumption that they would all see sex the way, I don't know, the way that he, and that's the other, like, that they would all see sex as something that was a threat if he had it with other women. There is something very strange about the way that we talk about sex in relationships. There's something that we do, so many people do, where they make sex into something that is in some way like every other part of a relationship is okay to have, but then sex is something different, and like we can only have sex with someone in a very specific context. And I really do think that harms us more than anything else, because as you can see, Zach ends up having sex with Gabi. He calls it a beautiful moment. It was an act of love, not an act of lust. To me, what this sounds like is when, okay, this is like kind of an extreme example, but to me what this sounds like is like, you know how I'm Catholic, so first of all, we'll get into the whole Catholic guilt thing, but I'm Catholic, and a big thing that Catholics are known for is their anti-abortion stances, and yet Catholics themselves do, in fact, get abortions, right? This is not like, it's not as if Catholics are in some way unique. They do also get abortions. They show up at abortion clinics and get abortions the same way. But then often what they do is like, well, my situation was really different. My situation was unique. That's why it was okay for me to do it. But in general, abortions are not okay. And that's to me what Zach was given in this moment. He was like, sex is not okay. Oh, but for us, it wasn't what you think. It wasn't lust. It was love. I'm like, Zach, you had sex for the same reasons everyone has sex in fantasy suites. You're not special. It's not special. And it just, to me, it felt like, and it just an excuse, instead of acknowledging that, like, hey, you made a wrong decision about how the way you were thinking about sex was wrong. He was like, no, but our sex was different. There was a good reason for us to have sex. And it's like, there's always a good reason. Anytime anyone has sex, there's a reason that they're doing it. And it who are you to say what's a good reason and what's a bad reason for people to have sex? And so I really do think that everyone trying to make sex into this thing that that you only do in a certain situation, that's only reserved for certain people in certain contexts and certain dynamics, I think that is making sex more special than it needs to be. I don't think we need to treat sex quite in that way. It can bond people. Of course, there's a lot of great things. I love sex. I'm not even trying to say anything like, it's like sex is great, but it's not as special as I think people try to make it out to be. And we see what happens from this dynamic. Look what happens when people try to turn sex into something that is like, oh my God, it's a thing that needs to be like the most special thing ever. When people try to do that, it leads to so much like kind of extreme and nonsensical behavior. And Zach lands himself in such hot water because he just had a really weird and wrong evaluation of what sex represents.
It's such a different point about how people are viewing how Zach interacted in the sex. I keep calling it Sex Week because he called it Sex Week. So now that's all I see it as. And now I see it as like
Sex Week.
Exactly, instead of fantasy suites. But it's such a great point because I'm also Catholic, and I understand why Zach was like, I feel that Catholic guilt. But don't confess your sins to these people that don't, like, they can't manage that for you. That's kind of a conversation you need to have privately with yourself, or to have privately with them without the cameras and the crew. Because what he did when he lit the production, Jesse, and all of the women into what happened between him and Gabi, which was not a bad thing, but it seems like a bad thing now because he went against his word, and his word means so much to him that this act is getting swirled up into it, and he's now like this blanket wrong. I did a bad thing. I am not a good person. I didn't, I wasn't honest to these girls when it didn't have to be like that. It was very striking how he was kind of taking his guilt and making it everybody else's problem. And that's
Yeah.
something that, you know, me and Kelly have talked a lot about on Here to Find Love, that he has a tendency to really center his own experience, center his word, center his honesty, center the way that he wants to do things. And for the most part, he has been rewarded. But now that it's down to the final 3 women that he has a special connection with, of course, sex will be special with each of them. He didn't have to continue qualifying it through any other lens. He could have really just interacted with all of them as their own thing. That was kind of how they wanted Zach to treat it. And I think Zach made a really big misstep.
Honestly, he was like, Fantasy Suites Week is known for being sex week. And it's like, is it? Honestly,
Is
like,
it?
so
Not
many
everyone
people,
has sex.
Not everyone has sex on these fantasy suites. Some people do, some people don't. Some people, you know, want to explore that physical connection. Some people just spend that time, like, talking about all the other important things in their lives. Like, it's never assumed that people have had sex. And, you know, that's the whole point. It's like, cameras are off. We don't know what happened. We don't know what you guys did. And, like, no one knows until you discuss it with your future partner. But it's like, it is not actually sex week, but you talking about sex this whole time and making this sex ban turned it into sex week. It made sex an even more prominent part of this conversation than it even needed to be. Like, he turned it into sex week. It's like,
he totally did. It is honestly so bizarre. I never thought Zach would be known as the Bachelor for sex. And here we are.
I know.
You know.
Oh my God. It's like, I'm coming in with all these kind of extreme examples, but it also reminds me of, you know, I teach sex ed to kids, right? To teenagers. I'm a sex ed teacher. And one thing that always grinds my gears are those like kind of like abstinence only sex ed programs where the whole point is like, don't have sex, don't have sex, don't have sex. And we know from research what this leads to, which is kids having sex earlier. Do you know why? Because when people are sheltered from information or told, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, what do? They do it, right? Versus when people are just able to have open conversations, when teenagers feel like all the adults in their life are openly talking to them about sex and not treating sex like this magical special thing that you're not allowed to have. And they're like, yeah, sex is just something that people sometimes do. And like, you make the choice when you are ready, when, you know, here's how to do it safely if you choose to do it. And this is what you need to know for whenever this part enters into your life, if it ever does. Like, here's the things that you need to know. When they're talked to in that straightforward way, it becomes less like, oh my God, it like demystifies it. Anyways, we're getting into a tangent here, but the point is, it's like when we try to treat reserved sex as like a special thing, it makes it into a much bigger deal than it often needs to be. And it makes it into something that can hurt more people. People kind of make more rash decisions around it, or every decision that people make around it seems very dramatic, as opposed to if we lowered the stakes around sex, then it doesn't need to feel so intense, each of these decisions. And that's why normal fantasy suites weeks don't have this much to do with whether or not the people are having sex. Zach made it into, okay, the big thing is like, can I get through these 3 dates without boning? Like, he turned it into that. And it never needed to be about that. It never needed to be so high stakes. And he made it high stakes.
I was stunned to see how quickly because the Ariel date, I was like, okay, this is going, you know, exactly like how he wanted it to go. And then as soon as it happened with Gabi, it was like he couldn't stop doing everything wrong that you complain about bachelors doing. Like, you know, just saying I love you, just being too open about certain things that they don't need to know about, especially like with the camera watching them. I do feel like if he wanted to have this conversation with them privately, have it off camera as much as possible, because now you said this thing to them, and now, for better or worse, Zach, you do regret what you did with Gabi because you said it when you were giving the rose to Kaity. How do you think that makes Gabi feel to get this rose knowing that she only got it because Zach slipped up? He did something that he didn't mean to do, and now he feels guilty. I feel kind of that Ariel was his final two. But now, because of what he did with Gabi, he had to give the rose to Gabi because like
he already told her he's falling in love with her. Things got so muddied with that. Yeah,
exactly. And they had sex. So how bad would it be if he like did not give her that thing to confirm what he was feeling? It feels icky all around. It feels icky if Gabby's chosen. It feels icky if Kaity's chosen. Gabi knows that maybe she got there on a technicality almost. Or Zach slipping up. And that can't feel great if you want to build a relationship with someone in like an actual marriage.
I don't know if it's like he's only keeping her because he had sex with her. I almost feel like it's like he's keeping her because he felt so bad about having to tell everyone that he had sex with her, that he had to tell her he was falling in love with her. Yeah. And because he already said he's falling in love with her, that is the thing that's like kind of keeping her. So it's less about whether or not they had sex as much as it is like all of his ridiculous actions around it that are kind of like, it's kind of like he had such a panic in how to handle what happened. It's like what we say sometimes. It's like sometimes people confuse intense emotions or like big emotions for like a stronger connection. And so he had these big confusing feelings related to what was going on with Gabi. And I think that was kind of confused with, that must mean I just like her the most because I have all of these, like, there's so much happening related to my relationship with her. And so I must really like her. And ditto with Kaity even, because when Kaity said, like, I'm feeling really distant, like, I need some space from you. I think he was starting to have all of these feelings, and it's the same thing of like, oh God, she's leaving. I'm losing her. I'm having these big feelings. That must mean I really like her. I really need her to stay. Like, I think he just had that with both of those girls versus with Ariel. It was a very even, non-dramatic date. And so I think that the lack of those big feelings and the lack of stress almost in that relationship was kind of why he was like, oh, I must not like her as much. And so he sent her home, even though I think he probably would have kept her into the final two. But I don't know. That's just a theory.
Yeah, I actually think so too. It was so confusing. This episode was so weird to watch because I was just like, what is Zach doing? Every conversation, I was like, Zach, you're making things a lot worse. You're not making them feel better. You're not comforting them, and you're not doing what you think you're doing. If anything, you're kind of making them all spiral. And then it's like, do they even feel safe enough to tell you that? You know, like, is that even a part of the conversation where they are like, Zach, the way that you're handling this is not okay? Because they can't even, in this moment, it would be something to call out for him and just to say, like, look, you don't need to tell me all of this stuff, but it's such a heated moment of fantasy suites and knowing that the next time they see each other, they're going to have an engagement. When Kaity and him were having that date, they couldn't even really get into it because how much can Kaity really say before they have an engagement the next week? All right, so how do you think Zach did with this no sex ban this week? Let us know in the comments down below. We're very curious.
Yeah, I have to know what other people think about this because it was weird. This is weird time.
Weird. I don't know what I'm saying at all this episode. I'm like, what is happening? Let's get into the actual details of what happened on each date. We'll go for Gabi first. So Gabi and Zach, they had a boat date. They had a very cute beach date where it actually made me like a little bit bummed out for Gabi to say so many like self-deprecating things about herself. I'm crusty. I don't feel good. I don't look good. I feel insecure. What is happening? She's so beautiful. She's so fun. She's so vivacious. And she was definitely getting into her head. I like that she was able to open up to Zach about her past experiences with her exes, like not feeling like she was enough, feeling like she has been cheated on, and how much it was getting in her head about how Zach had chosen her second for the fantasy suites. I liked how she was like, I'm walking away to have a second to think from this conversation because I'm feeling very, very overwhelmed. I think that Zach comforted her appropriately. He, was saying that he feels weird and insecure about comments that he makes and how he's being perceived and how he's coming across.
Yeah, I actually thought that this conversation was very sweet. Like the two of them are actually very cute together, Gabi and Zach. Their interactions they're like on the same page. They're on the same level. I did like watching this. However, once again, it did occur to me that initially when she brought up the second date thing, he had that face on where he had that face of like, oh God, you're gonna spiral. That face that he got with Jess, or the face that he gets when any girl kind of comes to him with like a concern or a need and he's like, I'm gonna send you home. But then when Gabi later swung around and was like, listen, I know that this doesn't actually have to do with you. I know that this is about me and my insecurities from my past bubbling up and affecting how I'm feeling in this moment. She was very self-aware, by the way. I was very impressed by her. She was very much able to identify, like, listen, I know that it's not actually a big deal that you picked me second for the fantasy suite state. It's just triggering my insecurities from my past relationships. Zach did do a good job comforting Gabi, but I didn't think, like, I think that if she hadn't been self-aware enough to understand that it was coming from her past, that I think Zach probably would have had maybe a more defensive reaction to this insecurity of hers. And like the same way he kind of with Jess was just like, why are you making it about the order of the dates? Like, why are you making it about this? Like, oh my gosh, if we can't get on the same page about this, I should just send you home. Like, I saw that was like the alternate universe where that conversation could have gone. But I think because Gabi was so self-aware and was able to recognize that it was not his problem but her problem, I think that's why the conversation went as well as it did. So I left the conversation feeling so impressed by Gabi, and like Zach, I was just kind of like, okay, like, you're fine. you did what you're supposed to do, which was like comfort her when she's feeling insecure.
From my perspective, it felt a little bit more like, because I totally agree with all of your points about how Zach, you know, he's always able to handle situations better where he feels like he's not the one being blamed or he's the one at fault. It depends on the depth of the connection of the girl that he's interacting with. So with Jess, I don't know if he was as into her as he is into Gabi, for instance. So because he is into her, you know, he like made that comment on the beach in his Talking Head interview of, whenever someone's upset, I want them to bring it to me. I want to be able to comfort them. Zach was definitely trying, but I think that he just generally is so focused on having a great time. And he kept saying that about Gabi. He was like, she's so fun. She's always so down. She's always so light. And she does kind of have that personality to her, because even when she was crying a lot about how she was feeling about her exes, she was being self-aware enough to be like, I know this is not about you. I know that I'm just putting everything on the table. And it was a little bit comical. This situation is kind of ridiculous, and this is where it's coming across, and, you know, word vomiting everything out. I could tell that Zach really responded well to that level of vulnerability, this kind of like lighthearted version of like opening up. So I think it like really carried well with the dinner portion, because it was like nothing had happened. They walked up to the dinner. Gabi's, you know, being super cute and squealing, it's so cute, it's so pretty. They like sit down and then they have, she was like,
kind of like back to normal.
She was back to normal. And Zach was like, that's my Gabi. That's like my good time Gabi, you know? So then it was interesting when he then tells Gabi what he told Ariel. But Gabi was a little bit like, to me, a little mischievous when she heard that information. She was like, oh, okay, like we'll see about it. Or, you know, just wanting to see how much he was willing to flex, right? Like, okay, well, let's just see. I think it's important, but we'll see how it goes. And then, you know, the overnight date happens the next morning, and they just both look like they have a secret on their face, because Gabi is smiling. She tells the camera, like, we had a really good cuddle sesh. They separate, and it's obviously very close, very sweet, very romantic, but you could see Zach kind of slowly spiraling of like, oh my gosh, I said this thing, I did another. I hate that this feels robbed. I hate that this feeling was taken from me. So like it was, I feel bad for Gabi, because it's like they had not like a secret, but they had their own relationship, and that own relationship is the both of them. It's not him, her, and Kaity. That's a love triangle, and that's what he kind of forced them in, essentially.
Yeah, you're right. It did seem like she was really happy that morning. I will say, I actually didn't like how she reacted to Zach when he stated that boundary. To me, it felt kind of disrespectful. Okay, maybe I should qualify this. I loved that she said, actually, I wouldn't say that I liked hearing that. Sex is very important to me, and I would never have imagined getting engaged to someone without having sex. Like, her saying that, I was like, I kind of loved it, because he kind of came in with this weird, like, anti-sex thing that felt a little presumptuous about, this is what women want. Women want this. And she was like, no, I want sex. And I kind of loved that from her. I was like, yes, like, tell him how it is. Like let your sexual liberated self be out on display. So I loved that from her. However, I didn't really like that she was like, okay, well, we'll see. To me, that's like not cute. I was like, if it was a man saying that he was going to try to convince a woman to have sex in the fantasy suites after she already stated that she doesn't want to, people would be able to see this for what it is, which is it's inappropriate to like hear someone's boundary and say like, I'm going to figure out how to get around that. I think that's kind of like a little gross, honestly. So this was the portion where I was like far less impressed with Gabi. If someone tells you that they don't want to have sex, that's not an invitation to like convince them. Like, it's okay, I respect your boundary and I'm going to find other ways to like, create intimacy in, our overnight time together. Not I'm gonna like get you to cross your boundary and go against your word, because if that's, and it's not really clear exactly how it went down. Of course, we didn't see how it happened in the fantasy suite, but I didn't really like her coming in with that attitude of just like, yeah, I don't really care about your boundary. Like, I'm gonna figure things out.
Zach made this assumption and he made it without considering her at all. So to me, it felt like Gabi was like, because I do get that it could seem manipulative, that it could seem like she was a little bit, the way that she handled that conversation was not proper, but I felt like she was doing exactly what Zach likes her to be, which is lighthearted, not taking things super seriously, and kind of being playful about what he's offering to her, because Zach, by him saying this, it is him being super serious, and it's also him being like, this is how I feel about it. This is what I want to do with all of the girls. And then later after they talk about that night, Zach says that he and Gabi had a conversation about it. So it's not like Gabi flung herself onto him and was like, I'm going to have sex with you no matter what. It seems like she actually had a conversation with Zach, which he did not get to do with Ariel. I think Ariel just like respected that boundary. It felt like a little bit like she just submitted and acquiesced to whatever Zach wanted without really considering what she wanted in the picture. It felt like Gabi was the first person to talk to Zach about it, and then she was able to immediately poke holes in how he was perceiving this week to be, and also like how all the other women would also take his very strong declaration. So it felt like as soon as he had that conversation with Gabi, he consensually opted into it too. I didn't think it was like gross what Gabi did, but I felt like that was kind of like, it was a little bit of like Zach's, I don't want to say it was like his fault, but it was his mistake to frame the conversation that way and to not have any input from the girls, because fantasy suites, it's not just about sex, it's also about conversation. It's also about really getting to know someone and getting to know what really matters to someone. And he, of course, like an entire night he has of Gabi, she's going to talk to him about it, especially if it is important to him. And he wasn't able to hold strong in his conviction because he understood, oh my God, this was made off of limited information. It was based off of how I consider other seasons to go. Okay, I'm going to have sex now. Like, it just seemed a little bit to me like, I didn't find it as gross for Gabi to have done that, I guess. I found it gross that Zach regretted it afterwards and then told everyone else. Like, I didn't like that from him.
I think both actions were gross personally. Like, I don't think that she, like, I don't think there was non-consensual sex involved. Like, it doesn't sound like that at all. It does sound like he was like, we had a conversation about it, which I do appreciate that she talked to him about whatever her thoughts on sex are. Like, appreciate that they were able to have that conversation. I think it was just that initial reaction to her, for her, like, winking at the camera, being like, we'll see what happens. I think that, to me, was the part of it that I was like, yeah, that's not how we talk. I just think that that's, when you're in a relationship with someone where you are a sexual person and like to have sex, and the other person has a boundary around that and just would rather not have sex either for this night or for a certain amount of time, I think it's really important for, if you guys eventually decide to have sex, it's really important for that to come with an enthusiastic decision from the other person. I think it's really important for the person who wants to have sex to not be pushing at the person who doesn't want to have sex. Because sure, like, of course, like, both people's needs need to be in the conversation for you two to have a healthy relationship, but it may very well be that this relationship isn't going to work. And you wanting to be in the relationship and wanting to have sex does not mean that therefore you get to have sex, right? And so I think that it's not like it's not like a right, you know, like it's like not just because like sex is important to Gabi that she has the right to have sex with him. Like I don't see it in that way. I think that if they had a conversation about it, which is what it sounds like happened, they have a conversation about it and they decide that they do want to do that. It does sound like that's what happened. And I think in that sense, totally fine. I think it was her initial kind of approach to the night that was the thing that kind of upset me, that she was just immediately dismissive of his boundary without really, like maybe he had a further important reason. We know that he didn't, but maybe he did. Like what if he did have like a further reason why he didn't want to have sex? Actually, scratch that. Even if he doesn't have any reason, I don't think people even need to have good reasons for not wanting to have sex. I think you could have the completely most ridiculous, nonsensical reason for not wanting to have sex, and you still have that right to not have sex. I think Zach had a ridiculous reason to not want to have sex, and he still has that right. So that's kind of how I was seeing that scene. And so I of course think it's like great, fine that they ended up having sex. It just was like the way she was approaching it initially. I think that was the thing that like kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I was like, and maybe she like, to your point, she was like just thinking about it as something playful, but I don't know. I just think that those are things you got to be really sensitive about. When someone tells you to your face, like, I don't want to have sex, I think that's something to be very, very sensitive and to be very respectful of people's right to say no to you, you know?
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. And it just feels like the biggest mishandling from that point was that Zach made that decision about consulting any of them. Because, like, how did he feel like they were going to each interact with it individually? From how he seemed like he framed the conversation, he did not regret it. It was completely consensual. He just regretted that Kaity, who is maybe his final pick, has to now be a part of this mess. And now be a part of something that he kind of created on himself, you know? Like, he could have just really kept it quietly, and he could have really just had conversations of them without the cameras, and he didn't need to make it into this narrative of him being known as a bachelor that didn't have sex on his fantasy suite week.
Yeah.
It could have been a totally different conversation that he had.
I guess, like, maybe what I would have hoped from Gabi, kind of like Ariel, like, would have been like that's like not how I see it. And this is what Ariel did, right? She says, that's not how I see it. I usually like having sex with my partners, but I respect that. And, you know, I'm looking forward to just having more conversations about it. Like that, I think is like, I really liked the way Ariel said it as opposed to the way Gabi said it. And I think one way Gabi maybe could have even risen to the occasion could have been for her to, in the fantasy suites, like when it starts progressing to the point of like, oh, like maybe we are considering having sex, for her to really pause and say like, are you sure that you want to do this? Like, I know I want it, but like, are you sure that this is what you want? Because I know that you've told me that it's important to you to not do this. And I don't want you to do something that you're going to regret. And I know that it would make me happy for us to have sex, and that would make me feel special, make me feel like the number one girl. But like, and that's the other thing. It's like, I wonder if, to your point, part of why she wanted to do it is because it would make her feel, it would assuage some of her insecurities. And in that sense, to me, it actually feels a little selfish on her part, because it's like a little bit of her thinking about like what will make me feel good, as opposed to, will Zach actually feel good about this, you know, tomorrow when we're out of the stupor of this overnight date? Will he actually feel good about this tomorrow? And clearly he didn't. And so I think it would have been, I would have really respected Gabi for being able to kind of think holistically about what would be in Zach's best interest. And like, you know, like I'm really like stretching, because I am so upset with a lot of things that Zach has done this season. And so for me to be so defensive of Zach is like out of my character. But like, I think I would have appreciated seeing that from Gabi. But to your point, I do think it sounds like they did have quite a conversation about this before they made the decision to do it. And so, and I just wish Zach wouldn't have gone forward and been like, man, I really that was such a mistake. It's like, if you thought it was a mistake, you shouldn't have freaking done it. Like, it's like, I'm just upset at it. I'm upset with everyone. Like, sex is a beautiful thing, and you all turned it into this weird thing that it didn't need to be. You could have just all enjoyed this beautiful moment. Zach even says this. He goes like, it was so beautiful, and it was robbed. I'm like, bitch, it was robbed by you. You robbed yourself of, like, a beautiful moment. It could have been something, like, lovely, and you turned it into this weird thing, like, saddled with shame and awkwardness and secrecy and over honesty. Like, you saddled it with all of those things. So it's like, no one robbed you of anything. It's like your own decisions. You are meeting the consequences of your own decisions. And so I was frustrated with Zach too. I was frustrated with a lot. There was so much I was frustrated with on this date.
Yeah, I mean, I was too, and that's why it's hard for me to fault anyone for anything.
Yeah.
That was, like, I can't see Gabi as being a bad person, because if Zach consensually agreed to it, which is what it seemed like he did, the only regret he had was with Kaity. So that is crappy, how he is as the lead, how he is as the Bachelor, how he wants to respect himself. But where are the other girls? Like, are they even actively being thought about the same way that you're thinking about yourself? And as soon as their needs enter the conversation and you change to it, how do you interact in that situation? To him, mistake, regret, doubt, uncertainty, annoying. Like, that is so frustrating to me, because, like,
it is frustrating.
He could have just had a conversation of Gabi beforehand, and then he could have gone into each of the dates and been like, this is what I'm thinking of. I want to have a conversation with you about what you're comfortable with. This is my comfort level. Let's talk about it. He did not go into the conversation like that. It was very much like, this is what I want, and that's what I want, and that's it.
Like, I think there was a lot of, it all kind of stemmed from this one ridiculous and nonsensical action, which was Zach declaring there should be no sex week, right? It all stemmed from that. And that's what I mean when I say, like, it felt like every action, it was, like, so hard for me to really piece out what was, like, how to
React.
think about each action, because, like, each action kind of stemmed from something that, the core thing that didn't make sense, which was Zach making this declaration in the first place. So it muddied almost, like, the way everyone was behaving in some ways. Like, it muddied everyone's ability to kind of, like, rise to their higher selves, right? Zach included, Gabi included. And, like, I think there's also something to be said about, like, you brought this up, like, Gabi, she was, like, trashing herself, like, a lot. Like, prior to the fantasy suite portion, like, earlier in the date, like, she was, like, really, like, God, I look gross, my hair is a mess, my makeup is everywhere, I'm crusty. Like, she was really, like,
it was
talking
hard.
poorly about herself, and it was hard. And Zach, Zach has talked back in Rachel's season, has talked about his own body image issues also. He has talked about, I think it had something to do with, like, his, like, weight and feeling, like, bad about his body, and which is really sad. And, like, it sounds like it kind of sounds like based on how that conversation with Rachel, it sounded like he was still kind of steeped in some of that, like, fat phobia, like, a little bit of, like, a,
like body dysmorphia.
Yeah, like body dysmorphia, and also just, like, fat equals bad, which is obviously not true. Like, he was in that kind of, like, headspace, and it sounds like he's kind of still in that headspace. So there's a lot that I think Zach has all of these weird feelings about his body. Gabi clearly has a lot of weird feelings about her body, and so I think the two of them in that way connect, but it's, like, not a good thing. It's like they both have these, like, body image issues that they seem to maybe connect on, and I kind of wondered if maybe some of that is what came up in their overnight date, because he was kind of describing it as, like, oh, it felt like something, like, necessary that we wanted to do to kind of, like, I don't know, like, the way he described it. So I actually kind of thought that the reason that they ended up having sex probably had something to do with that, like a conversation maybe about, like, how they feel about their bodies and, like, feeling good about themselves, like, that kind of conversation, as opposed to, like, a general conversation about how they feel about sex. My theory was, like, maybe something along those lines came up.
Zach's in the moment, and Gabi's taking it as confirmation that, yes, you're choosing me. You're choosing me. I'm the one. We're having sex out of these other girls you're making these declarations to. So then there is a little bit more of this, like, urgency or desire for maybe Gabi to want that more. which kind of, to your point,
right.
gives it that icky feeling. And that's the hard thing, because sex became more than just this physical act of like showing each other that you care about each other. It became confirmation of Gabi's worth and her positioning in his top 3.
Sad.
And then for Zach, it became, this is me as the Bachelor, and this is the season I want, and this is how I want to be seen for myself. So like they're wrapping up a lot of their self-image into this, you know, into Sex Week. And it was, it's tough. That's why I think it's hard for even us to parse through a lot of the opaqueness of this episode, because so much of it was like driven by their very unconscious agendas of what they were wanting to get out of this interaction. So like it was very murky between Gabi and Zach. I still don't know a lot of what really went down between them, and they were like the most confusing part to me this entire episode.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see if we get more information about this after the final rose.
How do you all think that Zach and Gabi handled the situation? Do you feel like Gabi handled it well? Do you feel like Zach did? Or do you feel like they just both fumbled? Let us know in the comments down below. We need to know, because we're still at a loss of like what to believe.
I think we're
or
like,
understand.
Yeah,
we're
just
like
confused
what's
about
happening?
it. Like it is very hard to parse through, because there's so many, to your point. It's like these layers of different agendas and insecurities, and there's so much happening here. So I'm curious what other people think about this whole interaction. Okay, let's get into the Kaity date, because this is kind of where things all really started falling apart. So they go on this like kind of like a swamp date. In theory, it was going to be like really cool and adventurous and romantic, but then it was like raining and there were like bugs everywhere. So it really seemed like if I was Kaity, I would have been pretty upset to be all in this kind of date that's like already like physically a little challenging, and then they sit down with their feet in the water in this like kind of mucky, bug infested place. She's like batting bugs away from her face, and then he's like, let me tell you about the sex I had last night with another woman. And it was like, oh no. Oh no, I just felt so bad for her. I mean, there was so much.
First off, like their date was very ominous, because it's like dark, it's storming, they're paddling down this like swamp area. It's not the best part or the best place to have this kind of conversation. A little bit of her was like, why are you telling me this? How do you expect me to respond? There's a lot of like pressure with the time of her knowing of, okay, this is the date, this is the last night that we have together before fantasy suites. She kind of just immediately put her feelings in a box and put it away. Of like, okay, well, like, I don't know how you want me to react with this. I feel upset about it, but I think you're really amazing. And I, still want to keep this connection going. It just felt so rapid, the way that she was able to process that and kind of immediately be like, okay, well, let's move on from this. And that is partly due to like Zach's handling. Like, we need to keep bringing it up this episode, because he keeps telling them a lot of information, and they have to, in real time, respond to something he's been thinking about for weeks, something he's like thought about deeply, something that he's been placing a lot of meaning on, and they have to react to him with him looking at them of, how do you say the right thing? How do I make sure that I'm not going to fracture the connection in any way? And a little bit of that might come from like being inauthentic with how they might really be perceiving the situation, because they don't feel like they can be super comfortable. It was hard for Kaity, because I'm sure Kaity feels like she is also the front runner, or she's the person that, could be at the end. I'm not certain anymore. I thought it was Kaity. Now I feel like it could be Gabi, because Gabi and him did have that intimate act. So like, I'm confused, and I'm just watching the episode. I can't imagine how Katie's feeling, because she's like, you said you weren't going to have sex, but then you had sex with Gabi. Where does that put me? What are you going to do with me tonight? It's a lot of power. It's kind of like being given back to Zach again and again, and I can't stand that. I really hate that.
On the one hand, I'm like, this is the whole reason why fantasy suites are not filmed, is the whole reason why we don't, at most seasons, we don't know whether or not people had sex, and that's kind of a good thing in some ways. It's good for us to not know, and it's not like the lead is expected to go around and tell each person like whether or not he did or didn't have sex with the other people, right? They all understand that like it is possible that he had sex with the other people, And I'll find out when the time is right if we end up together. And if I ask him and I want to know, I will find out. But like in this stage when we're compartmentalizing, it makes more sense for us to like make the most of the time we have together versus as soon as I find out that information and this is, Kaity kind of points this out. It's like when you find out that information, then you have the emotional response because we're human and human beings. Like if you are monogamous and you find out your partner had sex with someone else, that's really hard to deal with. It is really hard to deal with. And so Kaity had a normal human reaction, and I actually appreciated this about her. She even identified, she's like, I knew that this was a possibility. Of course I am upset, but she actually says, what I'm really just upset about is like that it's like now gonna like throw our whole date, the texture of our day off. I'm like frustrated because this is information that I already kind of knew, and now you're just making me like deal with it in the moment. And that's the thing. It's like when time is so limited, it's like after filming is over, you'll have all the time in the world to be able to process kind of what happened. But in the time that they have together, like that's why I think the compartmentalization of Fantasy Suite Week in most seasons actually makes a lot of sense, because it allows you to kind of, I think it is important for the final person to kind of know and like for people to be able to talk about kind of what happened, but it's like it's almost like reserving that for later when you know you'll have the time to really process it. As opposed to here, to your point, it's like Kaity's kind of forced to move through it so quickly. And I don't know if it's like, it's kind of Zach's fault. It's kind of like, it's like she's like being forced to like process that like over the course of like the time between the day portion of the date and the night portion of the date. They're like 2 hours in between she has to process.
You're so
versus
right.
In real life, like, you find this out, you get to process this for days, for weeks, if you need to, like however long it takes you to like think through it and make a decision about what you want to do or how you feel about it, right? But she's kind of forced to do it so fast, and that's why it's like there's a reason that this week is structured the way that it is, and Zach thought that he could outsmart it when he in fact just made it worse. I'll say to his very, very slight defense, I do think that because he already made that whole no sex ban thing, like because he already made it and that has colored the texture of his entire week by the time he got to Kaity, by that point, he did kind of need to tell her, because it was like if he didn't tell her that he had gone through the ups and downs of all the things that week and he went into that date and pretended like everything was fine, I do think that would have been a little inauthentic. It would have been like, it's like, all right, you made those decisions and now this is what you're going through. So you do need to kind of let her in and know the truth of what your emotional state is, so she can really, so both of you can really be present and this can be a real moment, as opposed to like him faking it and pretending like everything is fine. So I do think he had to tell her because he made that ridiculous no sex ban. But if he didn't make that ridiculous no sex ban and he had had sex with Gabi, I don't think it was necessary for him to tell her on this date. But it became necessary. So this is, again, what I mean when I say it's like it all started from that one nonsensical act at the beginning, which was declaring no sex all week. And it's like coloring every decision. And so like, it's like by this point, I kind of get why Zach had to talk to her about it, just from the stance of like, I don't want to fake it throughout this date. I don't want to like fake and pretend that I'm okay when actually I've been having a whole emotional roller coaster this whole week. Like I want to, like as my partner, if Kaity, you are my partner. I want you to see the real me and what's really going on in my life right now. From that stance, I get it, but it's like it all goes back to like, wow, you just really made a poor decision at the beginning of this week to turn this week into the chaos that it became. And I feel bad that Kaity just had to deal with it.
If I am being told information that is really going to impact me, I don't want 20 people, a camera crew, and the guy that I want to get married to looking at me. It's changing the way that I'm reacting, no matter what, no matter how authentic and honest I believe I am. How can you not feel that way when there's so much pressure on you to say something in a very limited amount of time? And that is typically why these conversations happen in the real world, when time is real again, when you can have a lot of space and time and, you know, the freedom to be your emotional self as much as possible. Kaity had to react, process, and then tie a neat bow on it within the span of an hour, because she's like, well, the date is kind of off kilter and I need to get it back on track, because I am also making the decision if I want to be with him, and I can't let this impact me. But now it's there. Now it's in the back of my head. Now I know that you're feeling guilt about it, that Gabi is feeling a certain way about it. I'm feeling a certain way about it.
Again, it all comes back to like he decompartmentalized what should be compartmentalized for the purpose of this process. And you know, I actually commend Kaity. Frankly, I think she handled it beautifully as you can in that moment, because the truth is, like, it actually is okay that he had sex with Gabi, and it doesn't actually mean anything about Katie's relationship to Zach. It actually is okay. And she even acknowledged that. She was like, I know it's okay, but I'm human and it hurts, so I'm upset. But I know it's okay. And like, I'm frustrated because it's like this tough emotion that is human and makes sense for me to feel. It's like, I'm just frustrated that it's happening here in the middle of my date when I only have so much time with you. And that's the thing that's like really frustrating me. It's like, I can't even get into how upset I am about the fact that you had sex with someone else. I'm not even going to go all the way into that portion of it, because it's like, I know at the end of the day, I know the answer to that is it's okay that you did it. So I can't get into that. I have to like focus on the fact that I'm just, it's frustrating that it's all happening here now in the middle of our so limited time that you and I have together. And I was just so impressed, honestly, for her to be able to parse that out, for her to be able to like really just like know the kind of the truth of what had happened, and for her to see it so clearly while also not masking her emotions and not like trying to like pretend that she wasn't upset. Like she did just such a beautiful job of being able to like kind of pinpoint all of the pieces of the things that were frustrating about this interaction. And I felt so impressed by her handling of this and her ability to say, listen, I know that you having sex is part of this, and I know that that's something that you had to do. And also I know that I'm upset because I'm a human, and also I'm upset because of the time, and also I know that if I spend all of my time trying to process through those emotions, I will lose the limited time I have with you, and so I'm going to move that processing, do the rest of it later. I'm going to just get to where I need to go, which is to go back to strengthening my connection with you. And I do hope that Kaity does return to the part where she gets to process everything. Like, I hope she gets to return to that in the weeks to come. To me, this felt like real emotional maturity. It felt like real emotional, like, mastery. Like, it felt so, it was big. It was a big person thing to do. Like, I just don't, like, I think of myself as like having like, you know, a lot of emotional intelligence and emotional awareness. I don't think I would have reacted as well as she did in that moment. Like she really nailed it. And yeah, I'm impressed. I would say just kudos to her for being able to handle Zach's bullshit.
I mean, you're so right about how she handled the situation. And that was what like Zach didn't understand. His final three had the capability to have that nuance in the conversation. He totally eliminated that from their relationships, and I got to see how all of them were able to interact to Zach's very strict rules, and it was a lot of understanding, a lot of grace, and a lot of what about my needs, which I think they all displayed. Kaity was like, I understand what you're doing, emotionally navigating it. Gabi's like, what about my needs? And Ariel was like, I'm respecting you. So all of them said something about their personality. Yeah. Right? And I just felt like Zach, when he made that declaration, he was completely dismissing that part of the conversation that could have occurred, because I felt like he could have handled that situation in a way where he really would have gotten to know the girls on a deep level, and he would have gotten to know a lot of different sides to them.
I was so impressed with all three of these women. They all handled such a complicated situation so beautifully. And damn, these girls are fucking amazing. And this guy is so mid. Like, he kept making so many poor choices, and I was just like, just so frustrated. I just think all of these girls are just so too good for Zach. I already thought that before, but I like feel it even more so now after watching this date. Like, all these girls are just, they deserve to be with someone who is as thoughtful and mature and self-aware as they are, and I think all of them keep displaying that, except for Zach, who, to your point, is like confused about what he wants, how he feels, what he should do. He's just like, he's a mess, and just, it's so sad.
After this week, do you still feel like Kaity is the front runner for Zach? Me and Kelly believe that she would be the perfect match for him just based on how she handled the situation. But let us know what you think down below. And speaking of class acts, we go to the first date, but the last date that we're going to talk about, which is his date with Ariel. And wow, she is just like chef's kiss. Everything of how she handled that date was beautiful. That date was very horny, by the way. They were like eating all of these things in the night markets. I mean, I love that, but they were like trying all of these exotic things and then just like making out with each other with food in their mouth. It was so evident that like, wow.
I actually had to close my eyes for that scene. It was too much for me.
It was gross. I was like, what is happening right now? Their physical chemistry was amazing to watch, and it was so playful and exciting. And I felt like when they had the dinner portion of the date, after they had such an amazing time just going through all of the different stalls, and Zach told her, you know, his no sex rule, I felt like Ariel did express her disappointment, but then she also expressed, I respect, I understand, and I appreciate where you're coming from. I'm not even going to push. I'm not even going to, like disrespect this boundary that you had. I feel like out of all of the girls, I probably would have occupied Ariel's position the most. Of me just kind of like backing off a little bit, but then it caused in a question, was she dismissing her own needs? Was she not able to speak up about something that she wanted? Because she had also spoken to Zach and the cameras about how she felt like, you know, sex was a really important part of the relationship, and that was something that she needed. So I felt like, dang, you know, if she was going to make it further, we know that she didn't, but if she was, then she was kind of, that opportunity was taken from her, and it was taken from her by Zach.
My guess is that they talked about it more in the fantasy suites, because she started talking about it in that dinner portion, right? She was starting to say like, yeah, like that, you know, when I set those rules for myself, I almost always break them. Like she started saying that. So she was like kind of explaining, but she was like, but I respect you. So she was, my guess is that they would talk about it more in the fantasy suites in private. I can't really imagine Ariel, just from what we know about her, to be someone to like tamp down on her own needs, as opposed to like Kaity. I kind of see her doing that sometimes. Like I kind of feel like Ariel is the type of person who probably did talk more about it. But I will say, like, to your point, it's like, that's I think how I would handle the situation too. It's like, okay, like I think sex is really important, and if we're going to be in a relationship together, like that's going to be something that we'll have to talk about. But like if you don't want to have sex tonight, cool, we don't have to have sex tonight. Like that's okay. Like as long as like this will be an ongoing conversation where we can make sure my needs are going to get met eventually in this relationship, then that's cool. Let's like, I can not have sex for one night. That I will survive, especially to your point, because they were like so horny for each other on that date. It was like there was not even really a question, honestly, that there was like sexual chemistry between them and sexual like, you know, sparks. Like, so it wasn't, to me, I was like, honestly, it's like you don't even, in some ways it's like more fun to not have sex and just like enjoy some of that. And she kind of said that she's like, we'll find other ways to like keep it steamy. And damn, she came out in that bathing suit, that like red bikini. I was like, good Lord. Like,
I know. Stunning.
I was like, oh my word, like, gee whiz. All of the build up to sex is like the part of all the fun of it too. Being like all these like hot makeouts in the water and just like a little bit of like, you know, exchanging these like kind of flirtations. It's like all of that stuff is like also fun. So you can still find ways to keep it steamy while still respecting his boundaries, which I kind of feel like is the approach that she took. And I kind of loved that. It was like, okay, yeah, like you're kind of meeting in the middle almost. It's like finding a way to keep that energy in the relationship while also, or in the night, like the energy that she's seeking, like she was finding a way to keep it in the night and in that evening, right, without crossing the line that he wanted to keep. So I thought that was actually kind of a good way for her to approach it.
That's why it was so disappointing that she went home. I still have a speculation that she might have been his top two if things didn't happen like that with Gabi, because I think that she played it exactly the way that he really valued in a person. And it's not like Gabi did anything wrong. Gabi advocated for her needs and Zach met it. Dang, she just got like dogged this episode, I think. Like she respected his wish. He didn't like communicate what actually happened, all of these things happening in the periphery, and then she was just sent home like none the wiser about the situation. That disappointed me based on how considerate, how respectful, how caring she was for Zach. He did not convey that to her at all, and it just will confirm to me, like, I knew Ariel was too good for Zach. I know it now. Like, it's 100% that. And it's not like a value of her being cooler or her being more mature. It's just the fact that, like, that level of respect was not there. She had it for him. He did not have it for her. Therefore, she is too good for him, because the kind of person that she is with, it will be mutual and it will be reciprocated, and it won't be something that she has to like, hi, remember me? I'm also the person that is a part of your, you know, a part of your journey as well. Don't dismiss me because I was the one that gave you less trouble, and you're focusing on the people that had more things going on. Made me sad for Ariel, but I just know she's going to be like the queen of paradise if she so chooses. She could be the Bachelorette in the future as well. She just has that kind of vibe to her.
I completely agree. I would love to see her eventually be the Bachelorette as well. Like, she is just, oh gosh, she is everything. Like,
I know, she's
intelligent
stunning.
and mature and respectful, but sexy and like interesting and cool, and like she just and she's a good backstory. She has an interesting story that we talked about this last week that's different from most of the types of contestants that we tend to see. I would love to see a Jewish Bachelorette. Like, there's so many reasons that I would love to see more of Ariel. But yeah, let's see what's in store. I'm excited. I was sad to see her go. I'm pissed off at Zach for the way he treated her. He just treated her like she was nothing. It was kind of like, well, I'm not going to date you anyway, so you don't need any of my respect. You don't deserve my honesty. I don't owe you anything. I'm going to break up with you.
I'm stunned that he said that. It's like, how did you not include her into like all of these things that you're saying and thinking about? Like, what?
Let us know down below what you all thought about Ariel, how she handled her situation on her fantasy suite date with Zach, and what do you think about the way Zach handled her and the way he didn't tell her about everything that happened? Let's talk about it down below.
So let's talk about what Zach could have done differently. What he could have done better.
Okay, you gotta start out soft. I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts about this.
I mean, I just have one singular thought, which is, why didn't he keep, like, he didn't have to craft this narrative with production. Production is going to bring a camera to every interaction. They're going to hold him very strictly to, like, whatever he's telling them, which is, I do not want to have sex this week. So that's going to be my word, and I'm not going to back down on it. Now, Jesse's in the picture, production's in the picture. Everyone is getting in. It's not just production in terms of like how they're weaving the story. It's how they're talking to the woman privately in their own talking heads, getting in their heads, making them more confused, giving them more uncertainty. If he really wanted to be a season about love, he could have really kept strong to maybe production doesn't need to know every little thing. I know what I privately want for fantasy suites. I know that I want to get to know these women, and that's all I need to know. I felt like how he could have played it differently was that he could have just gone on the dates, had a lot of fun with them, had the conversation privately in the fantasy suites. Whatever happens in the fantasy suite stays in the fantasy suite. Whether he has sex, whether they have a deeper conversation, whatever the context is, let it be what it has to be for that own relationship. Give them some kind of privacy. Despite the fact that you're on a TV show and your love story is being televised across millions of like people, they don't have to know every single little thing about your relationship with these women. We are not owed to that. It's up to him to make the best decision for himself. And I felt like that conversation would have been really beautiful, because at the end of the 3 dates, he could have just told the camera or production, I had a really beautiful time and it was exactly what I needed. I learned a lot about them. Point blank, period. Production would have been able to figure something out from from their conversations, from Zach and the woman. They would have been able to weave something together, and I think it would have kept Zach trending in a positive direction of him as a bachelor, because I'm trying to find ways to compliment him on a season, because I don't want to be negative to him. Me and Kelly are constantly just like, wow, we need to figure out a way to, like, see him for the good and the bad and celebrate him for both equally and kind of like criticize him in the ways that he's falling short. So I don't know, like as soon as he kind of let everyone into his decision-making process, his transparency to me just felt like he was putting himself in a trap. Because now you showed your hands, everyone knows what you're trying to do, and you know, TV will manipulate as much as they can. So he put himself in a really tricky situation. But that's kind of what I think. What do you feel like he could have done differently?
There's so much I think he could have done differently. I completely agree with you that there is an element of privacy that, you know, would have probably helped, and that's built into this week, and he just kind of obscured that or like threw it away. And I think that would have been helpful for him to retain. I also think that, to your point, sex is something that's so personal, that's so individual. People have different feelings about it, right? And it goes back to what I was saying about, like, you know, it's like an abstinence-only sex education program. It's like you're trying to force everyone into one perspective, one point of view, trying to force one approach onto everyone, when the reality is that people just have different relationships to sexuality. They make their decisions differently. Their priorities are different. Their values are different. And people need to be able to make those decisions for themselves in any given relationship that they're in. And I think that that's what Zach didn't do. He didn't think about, let me make this decision in each relationship depending on what my relationship is to that woman, what I want and what that woman wants. Like, let's make that decision on an individual basis, right? It's that I think really would have helped him avoid a lot of this, the chaos that ensued this week, if he had really treated each woman individually and made these decisions individually with each person. There is something so beautiful to learning about how each person thinks about and views sex, how they, you know, think about sex in relationship to any given relationship, like how important sex is to their relationships, and et cetera, how they feel about sex, how they value it or don't value it, where they kind of see it in the range of other things that are happening in the relationship. Like, there's so much beautiful about learning that about someone and having those conversations with someone. And it did kind of feel like Zach, to your point, kind of like made this pronouncement across all of them that removed so much of that nuance and that ability to go deeper with each woman and really learn about how they feel about sexuality. And, you know, I think he thought he was doing it to like be a good guy, but in reality what it ended up doing was just hurting everyone. And what it ended up doing was kind of trying to enforce his view of what a healthy relationship looks like onto each of these relationships. And it was to everyone's detriment. I also think that he kind of made this decision that wasn't in line with actually how he really feels about sexuality, right? It seems like he made a decision about sex that didn't even really make sense with how he typically pursues sex in relationships. I come back to like the Gabi thing. It was like he said, like, oh, it was with us, it was special. With us, it was different. It was an act of love, not an act of lust. And it's like, listen, man, like, it's okay. People have sex for so many different reasons, so you don't need to explain to us why you had sex. Like, you don't need a good reason for why it happened. Like, you know, you don't, it is like how it happened between the two of you, whatever was important, whatever, you know, wherever that night went, that's where that night went. And I just wish that he had known himself well enough to understand, like, hey, this is how I actually feel about sex. That there are situations where, you know, I love having sex with someone, like when there's the right emotional context or the right physical context, whatever it might be. Like, I wish he would have known that about himself and not try to paper it over with these assumptions about what the girls want, these concerns about how it'll look on TV, these concerns about, like, you know, he like tried to paper over basically his own real feelings about sex, and it hurt everyone. And like, if he had just been realistic of like, I'm just gonna go into each relationship, and honestly, this is kind of how I feel about sex in general, and this is just me, but I kind of think that, you know, you go into every relationship and based on how that relationship is, and based, like, I'm going to figure out how I feel about sex and that person, how that person feels about sex, and we co-create a relationship together, and sexuality will have the relationship that me and this person have to sex might be different from the relationship that me and the next person has to sex, and that might be different from how me and the next person, you know what I mean? It's like, I think there is something to be said for like really being thoughtful about each relationship that you are in and thinking about, you know, what makes sense for us and what makes sense for me in this moment. And, you know, it might be that Zach realized on every date, he's actually like, yeah, I just don't want to have sex. Like I keep like kind of thinking about like, you know, I want to save that for my future wife. Like I keep thinking about that, and I hope that's okay. That's okay for him to have that conversation with, you know, Ariel, but then maybe he gets to the date with Gabi and he's like, actually, I'm in this relationship, I'm feeling something else here, and like this is actually what I want, which is to have sex. And then he gets to his relationship with Kaity, and whatever would have happened there if all this other stuff hadn't happened, you know, happens there. It's like that individual thinking, I think, is what Zach really lacked here, and that own self-awareness and that ability to kind of, you know, see the relationships as each individually something that he's co-creating, as opposed to something that he pronounces like this is what's going to happen.
That's what an actual relationship is. It's a negotiation, it's communication, and it's figuring out their needs with your needs as well, not just kind of being so steadfast in what you expect and leading into the relationship of that. But that's how Zach has shown us, that's how he views partnership a little bit. It's not entirely selfish, but I do think that he does look at himself quite a bit, and he is quite focused on his own experience with it. So yeah, like I think that you're totally right. Him co-creating the conversations would have made this a much different ending, and it would have made it a much different love story for each of the women.
Yeah.
And I feel like it would have also given quite a bit of respect to Ariel as well. And he didn't have it happen that way, because I'm giving him some benefit of the doubt. I'm sure he was maybe crunched for time, and he was wanting to repair his most important relationships, which was Gabi and Kaity. So then Ariel is immediately put to the side because it's not as important as the ones that he's trying to save. That's the crappy thing of it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Well, let us know what you all thought about overall how Zach did this week and what you think he could have done differently. I know a lot of people have strong opinions about this, so let's keep the conversation going down below. Next week is the finale. It's a longer episode. I think it's 3 hours long. It's both the, you know, engagement portion as well as the after the final rose. It's all happening next week, so there's gonna be a lot to talk about. If you are not subscribed to our channel, make sure you do hit that subscribe button, because we do recap every single episode of The Bachelor, and we will definitely be talking about this season finale. I'm sure there's gonna be a lot to get into, and we cannot wait. So we will see you all then. Bye.